Good afternoon. I think we're going to get started. Before we start the session today, I just wanted to acknowledge the councillors that are in the room. Welcome to Councillor Davis and Councillor Perks. So thank you so much for attending today's public information session of the final report of the Toronto Ward Boundary Review. My name is Fiona Murray and I'm the Director of Corporate Intergovernmental and Agency Relations in the City Manager's Office. We also have with us here today the authors of the report, Beatty Bowron of Bowron, Beatty Bowron, etc. Incorporated, Dr. Gary Davidson of the Davidson Group, and Lisa Kaviccia from the Canadian Urban Institute. They will be speaking in depth shortly, walking you through the report. A couple of housekeeping items. So the final report of the Toronto Ward Boundary Review went public today at 10 a.m. and was part of the Executive Committee agenda release. It can be accessed online and through the City Clerk's office. The purpose of this information session today is to provide members of the public an opportunity to gain a better understanding of the report and the final recommendations. The session is also being live streamed on the city's Get Involved TO YouTube channel. And the session is going to go as follows. So once I conclude, the consultants are going to speak to the contents of the report. Following the end of their presentation, the public information session will conclude. The consultants and city staff will remain in the room for a limited period of time to answer individual questions. We will not be doing a formal question and answer as part of this information session today. So as way of background, in June 2013, City Council directed a ward boundary review and asked the city manager to retain a third-party consultant to undertake this work pursuant to terms of reference that were approved by City Council. In June 2014, City Council approved the consultant's work plan, civic engagement, and public consultation strategy for the Toronto Ward Boundary Review, and the review included jurisdictional research, review of relevant legislation and research, a two-stage engagement strategy that included in-person public consultation sessions, web and social media-based engagement, and multiple one-on-one meetings with stakeholders, school boards, the public, and members of council between 2014 and 2016. So in keeping with the direction from council, the Toronto Ward Boundary Review final report has now been submitted to the city and will be considered by Executive Committee and City Council. The report will be considered at the Executive Committee meeting coming up on May 24th. Members of the public or other stakeholders may register to depute by contacting the clerk, and that information is available online or through the City Clerk's website. So now, without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to the consultants.
Thank you, Fiona. I'm Lisa Kaviccia with the Canadian Urban Institute. I also just wanted to point out we've got a couple other team members in the audience, Ariana Concelli, Glenn Miller, there, and Jonathan Critchley, who's our mapping and GIS guy. So Gary and Beata are going to go through I'm just going to talk about the steps of this information session. Gary and Beata are going to start with giving you an overview of the final report, which has now, as Fiona said, been released on the city's website. And it's also going to be available on our drawthelines.ca website shortly. Next, Gary and Beata are going to talk about the steps in the process that we went through, as well as the why we need a Toronto Ward Boundary Review. They're going to go over the results, which what came out of the process that we went through. They're going to go into, they're going to present the final recommended ward structure, as well as go into detail on what the changes are in comparison to the current ward boundary structure. And then they'll end with some conclusions and talk about some of the next steps in the process. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Next slide, please. And the next slide, please. So for those of you who have seen the report, this is not a surprise. The report has a number of components. There is an executive summary. Then we're talking about why the whole review was undertaken and the steps that we went through. The next section, we talk about the preferred option and refinements to the option, and I'll say some more about that later. Then there's another section which recommends a new ward structure for Toronto, and then there is a conclusion and next step section. Next slide, please. These are the appendices, and I just want to draw to your attention the fact that Appendix C has all the suggested refinements that are relevant to the option that is the preferred option, that is option 1, and also has in it refinements that were suggested to all of the other options that are relevant to option 1. So Appendix C is where people can find some of the suggestions that they made. We had about 130, I think, suggestions, and we were able to incorporate into the final recommended ward structure about 65% of them. Next slide, please. Fiona, I think, outlined briefly already the type of work that we did as required by our terms of reference. So we did background research of the legislative context of ward boundary reviews. We looked at ward boundary reviews in other cities and also examined OMB decisions regarding ward boundary reviews. Then there was the first round of the civic engagement and public and consultation process, where we collected input on what people thought of the current ward structure. Then we published an options report with 5 options, and had a second round of the civic engagement and public consultation process where we collected feedback on the options, people's ideas, and people's inputs. From there, we found the preferred option, and we looked at the refinements, and at the end, we made a recommendation. Next step, please. So why was the ward boundary review needed? Toronto's population, as it says up there, is now about 2.9 million, and about 500,000 extra people are expected to come between 2011 and 2030. In 2014, the average ward for the 2014 election was 61,000, and in 2014, the smallest ward was 45,440. And you will see, if you have the handout, that there is a different number for the largest ward. That number was an error. It was a 2018 number, but the 2014 number of the largest ward was 94,600. So there was an enormous variance, minus 25 to plus 56%, and that is too large a variance to be a workable, sustainable ward system. So it's important to note that the size of the population size of a ward affects, of course, how residents are represented at City Council, and that's not just at election time, but every time Council votes. So we concluded from this stage that the status quo is not an option. So what was the review all about? And you can see what it was about. We looked at the size and shape and for populations in the future. And then we looked at a very important concept in ward boundary reviews, which is effective representation. There are a number of components to this concept, which is the concept that has been pronounced on by the courts and upheld at various OMB hearings. The first and very important component is voter parity. And voter parity doesn't mean that every ward has to have the same number of people. They just have to be similar. They don't have to be identical. Another very important component is the concept of geographic communities of interest. The idea is to keep them together, not split them, unless you absolutely have to, and then you have to have a really good reason, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Usually, ward boundary reviews want to make sure that you respect natural and physical boundaries, ward history, and another component is the capacity to represent. So the capacity is not to represent doesn't have anything to do with how well or you think a councillor is representing you. It has to do with the issues in a ward, what kinds of things does a councillor have to deal with. Some wards are just residential, other wards have infrastructure in it, yet other wards have a daytime population, a nighttime population, industrial areas, employment areas, and so on. So that's the component of capacity to represent. What is this review not about? And we have said that during the whole public process. This review is not about how Toronto's government is organized, how city council operates, how people vote. You know, it's not about ranked ballots, it's not about proportional representation. It's not about the quality of the job that a councillor is doing or how good anybody thinks city services are. So that's what it's not about. So let me just talk a little bit about the first round of our civic engagement and public consultation process. We interviewed all members of council, and in that instance, those were the members of the then sitting council and some of the new members of council. We had interviews with stakeholder groups such as the school board, United Way, Civic Action, Social Planning Toronto, and so on. We had an advisory panel, which met only a few times, but it was made up out of people who know something about the subject, and they helped us clarify the way we had put forward concepts. We had a very, very active website, as Lisa said. It's drawthelines.ca, and many of you are on our mailing list and got a lot of emails from us. We wrote 5 reports and published them. We put on this website information about the review. We invited people to public meetings via the website. There were media releases. And as I understand it, we had an average 330 some monthly visits. So we also had 12 public meetings during round 1. There was an online survey, and at the conclusion of the round 1 process, we published an options report in August 2015. The second round of the process was in many ways a repeat of the first round. The only thing we did is we added a webinar at lunchtime because we thought that perhaps not all people could come to the public meetings and they would appreciate an opportunity to communicate with us online. But otherwise, the process was the same, but in this instance, we asked people what they thought about the 5 options and what their suggestions were about what to do with them. And the upshot of the round 2 report was our final report with a recommendation as requested by the terms of reference. We were to make one recommendation for a new ward structure for Toronto. So Gary is going to talk about the results.
Okay.
Okay.
So as Beata said, we started with 5 options. They were the options that we developed after the round 1. And then in round 2, we went out with the options to the public and to members of council and talked about them. We asked them to rank them, and we asked them to make suggested refinements. The first option was called minimal change, and then there was an option that had 44 wards, the same as now. There was a small ward option, a large ward option, and then there was an option based just on natural and physical boundaries. Next slide. And this is just a chart that shows some of the main parameters, and they are the average size of the ward. So with the minimal change, the average size was 61,000, which is what it currently is. 44 wards, of course, as the population grows, the ward size increases, and it would have gone up to 70,000. The small ward option was based on an average ward size of 50,000. and the large wards was 75,000, and the natural and physical was 70,000. And of course, they all yielded different numbers of wards. So the minimal change option was 47 wards. Of course, the 44 ward option was 44. The small ward option was 58. The large wards was 38, and the natural and physical boundaries yielded 44 wards. And generally speaking, we used, try to get the wards within 10% plus or minus the average, and with the minimal change ones to try to keep changes as small as possible, we kept them between plus or minus 15% of the average. Next slide. During the public consultations and the councillor consultations, in some instances, the federal and provincial ridings came up. The question being, can we just use the federal provincial ridings? And in the case of Toronto, split them in half. As most people know, Toronto's current wards were based on older provincial ridings and then split in half. And there are 22 provincial ridings, or were 22 provincial ridings, and they were split in half to give you 44. For the recent federal election, there were 25 ridings in Toronto. And a lot of people talked about that. Very few people liked the idea of 25 wards because the ward sizes would be about 123,000, and the people felt that was a little too large. Splitting them in half would, of course, give you 50 wards. Some of the federal ridings split communities of interest, and also the population ranges are quite large. There's some of the wards would be well below 20% below the average. Also, the federal ridings are revised every 10 years, so there would be continual change. I've been referring mainly to the federal ridings because the provincial ridings are in the process of being changed, and most people anticipate that they will change to the federal ridings, so that there will be 25 all within the City of Toronto. Next slide. So the idea of looking at the 5 options during round 2 of the public process was to determine what was the preferred option. And to do that, we got a lot of input, and we analyzed it basically in 4 ways. First of all, we looked at first choice. What did the people and the councillors rank as their first choice of the options? We also used a ranked score. We asked them to indicate which was their first, second, third, fourth, and fifth choice. So we actually got them to rank the options. We also looked at the last choice, and then we compared the first and the last choices, because in the final analysis, drafting a new ward structure is about building a consensus. Next slide. And we just used a fairly simple process. If the options scored first, it got 5 points. If it scored fifth, it got 1 point. And if it wasn't ranked or people said, no, I don't like it, it didn't get any points. Next slide. So this is the base data for the public survey. Now, there were 2 surveys, one for the public and one for members of council. And they're kept separately so that we know how each group thought, and then they're brought together at the end. So if you look at this is the base data, which gives you which option was ranked first and how many times, and right through to not ranked at all. So it gives you the data for all of the options. But next slide. Looking at the public survey, the first choice was the small ward option. And the second choice was a large ward option. And then the other ones fell below that. Now, the interesting thing when you look at the rank score, and that includes second, third, fourth, and fifth choices, the minimal change option came out as the top choice, followed by the 44 ward option, and then the other ones fell down. Now, next slide. Now, if you look at a comparison of first and last, for the public survey, one of the interesting things to notice is option 3, which is the middle one. And that sort of option 3, which is the small ward option, which is based on 50,000 and 58 wards, was something that people either really liked or they really didn't like. All that means is that it would be a very difficult option to build a consensus around. Next slide. Turning to the members of council, again, this is the base data. One thing that is different, a little different in this slide than in the members of the public, is that there's a ranked no. Some councillors just said, no, I don't like that one at all. Whereas the public didn't have that option because we weren't meeting with them face to face. And again, this is the basic data structured the same way as the public survey. You'll also notice at the bottom that 42 out of the 45 members of council participated in this. Now, next slide. If you look at the first place choice, the first place choice was the minimal change option, followed by the small ward option. When you go to the ranked score below that, the minimal change option is still number 1, and the second one is the 44 ward option. And if you look again, change this next slide, please. Again, you'll see that when you look at option 3, that it's the one that you either like it a lot or you don't like it a lot. And that was quite similar to the public survey. Next slide. So when you look for all of this data for the preferred option, option 1 emerges as the preferred option. It was ranked first by the public. It was first place and ranked first by the members of council. So that sort of starts the next stage. So when you come out and say, okay, option 1 was the preferred option, then we went to the suggested refinements that we got on option 1 during our public involvement process. And each one was examined, and we were able to incorporate an awful lot of the suggested changes. And about 2/3 of the suggested changes we were able to incorporate. So the preferred option map, next slide, is option 1 plus the refinements. So the recommendation is different from option 1. So if you're looking at option 1, the minimal change option, and the preferred option map, you'll notice that there are some changes. And those changes result from suggestions made by the public and member of council for improving that option. Next slide. So, and this is the map. You have the map in front of you of the recommended wards. There are 47 of them, which is the same as the minimal change option. The average ward size is based on 61,000.
They have this map.
And there's, no, we don't use that. And also, the preferred option is on the big maps at the back, and there's an overlay on those maps, and that overlay is the existing wards. So if you wanted to look at the difference, you can look at them in those maps there. We had attempted to make a two-dimensional map of the recommended wards overlaid by the existing wards, but it became very, very difficult to read. Next slide. After that, we had to relook because we had at the preferred recommendation and recheck it for voter parity, for geographic communities of interest, and for coherent boundaries. Next slide. This slide may be a little hard to read, but generally speaking, there are 44 wards that fall within the plus or minus 15%. There's one ward that is below average, that's Ward 20 at 15.82%, but it's the fastest growing ward in the city, so it's growing pretty fast. There's two wards that are above average, recommended wards 15 and 41, and they're just slightly above 15% at 15.27 and 15.26. Next slide. We had made a lot of effort to keep communities of interest together. It's not always possible. Some communities of interest are just too large, and so they had to be split, like Jane Finch, because it's just too large to be all in one ward. And in some cases, choices were necessary because keeping one community of interest together meant dividing another, although we tried to minimize that as much as possible. Next slide. We used some of the main natural and physical boundaries as determinants. The Humber River, Victoria Park, Highway 401. We also used the downtown as an area within which to place wards, so that the downtown now has 6 wards, and they're all within the downtown areas defined by the official plan. Eglinton Avenue generally is another major divider of wards, and then below that we use major roads. Now, we're going to do an overview of the changes, and I'll hand it back to Beata.
So, as Gary said, the new ward structure is similar to the old option 1, but is also different. In option 1, there were 18 wards where there were no changes at all. And now there are only 6 wards whose boundaries, the boundaries of which don't change at all. So that is a change. The total number of wards remains at 47, just like in option 1. And as Gary said, the average ward population is still 61,000. But of course, there is the range of plus or minus 15%. And our target year is 2026, because if the changes work for 2026, they will still work for 2030. And then they will also work for 2018 and 2022. This map, I want to, you have a copy. If you picked up a copy, you have a copy, a large copy of this map. And it looks like that, and we also have a display copy of it. In your handout, there is a little arrow of this map because, and you can see it up here, the recommended Ward 19 is shown as being in the downtown. It should be buff color, not green, but that's no real change. It changes nothing except we put the wrong color on Ward 19. On the big maps, we have managed to change it, but in the presentation, it's not changed. I just wanted to let you know that. So there were no changes. I'm just going to get up and be really loud. There were no changes in 4 areas in terms of the number of wards. The first area is over here, west of the Humber. There were 6 wards, and there's still 6 wards. East of Victoria Park, there were 10 wards, and there are still 10 wards. South of Highway 401, and generally five wards in this area. The changes are in the downtown, in this area, where there used to be 3 wards and there are now 6 wards. And they have the downtown wards have shrunk a little because they are now within the boundaries, inside the boundaries of the downtown. Up here, in this area north of the 401, there is an extra ward, and the now 7 wards grow to 8 wards. And west of the downtown, in this area, there is 1 less ward. There are 7 wards now, and the recommended ward option, the recommended structure recommends 6 wards in that area. So, next please. So to summarize the changes, there is one ward that is added north of Highway 401 between Bathurst and Victoria Park. And there are 3 additional wards downtown, and there's 1 less ward west of downtown and generally south of Eglinton Avenue. Next. So, in conclusion, the new ward structure in our opinion, achieves effective representation. This is the recommended ward structure, I have to stress. It respects public and council members' input, and we think it can last until 2030. Next steps. As you all know, these are recommendations in the final report, and this report is going to be at the Executive Committee meeting next week, on Tuesday, on May the 24th. There will be obviously an expectation that Council will take some time to discuss this, and we think that perhaps that will happen in the summer and fall of this year. It'd be important that there be a Council decision, hopefully by the end of 2016, because any new structure of any kind is supposed to be implemented in time for the 2018 election. There may be an Ontario Municipal Board hearing. Of course, Council decides what kind of a ward structure they want to have, but they pass a bylaw to do so, and that bylaw can be appealed to the Ontario Municipal Board. And in our experience, that has happened quite often in the past. Next slide, please. So we think that the timeline is fairly critical because there is probably going to be an OMB hearing, and 2017 will be needed to resolve any such hearing. And then, of course, the clerk needs time to put whatever council decides in terms of a new ward structure into an implementable form so that it's going to be ready for 2018. And that's our presentation. Thank you.
So thank you very much for coming today. This concludes our public information session, and as I said at the beginning, the consultants and city staff will stay in the room for a limited number of time to answer individual questions, but we won't be doing a formal Q&A. Thank you.